everyone. This is the third lecture of the Sunday night evening lecture series, and this is the third one in the special forum called Reflections of Pandemic, COVID Pandemic. And I'm very happy to introduce to you our speaker and translator this evening. First of all, I introduce Mr. Nipun, who is on the screen here. And Nipun is the founder of Service Space, a global community at the intersection of technology, volunteerism, and gig economy. And since its founding over 15 years ago, it now has more than 500,000 volunteers. And over the years, he has done tremendous amount of community building grounded on their locality and rooted in the practice of cultivating love, nonviolence, selfless service, and compassion. The ecosystem has reached millions, attracted thousands of volunteers, and mushroomed into numerous community-based service projects, as well as inspiring content portals. Service they harness the collective power of networks and our deep interconnectedness to create a distributed social movement founded on small local individual acts of kindness, generosity, and service that ignite shift in individual collective consciousness. And Nipun was honored as an unsung hero of compassion by Dalai Lama. And not long ago, former US President Obama appointed him to a council for addressing the poverty and inequality in the United States. Yet the core of what strikes anyone who meets him is the way of his life, attempting to bring smiles to the world and silence in the heart. And I remember I want to share a story when Nipun and I were in Taipei one time, and we had an evening lecture where he was the keynote speaker. And after his speech, a group of us went to a place to eat, to taste shaved ice cream. I think Nipun was the first time, right? And so typical to Nipun, when it's our time to get shaved ice cream, he just put out the entire amount of his honorarium to the server, said, well, save us, after you served us, the rest of the money for everybody behind. And nobody knows, of course, who did this. And they were giggling and all that and Nipun told the server, don't tell them who have done this. And so one of the people who are with us later on in celebration of her mother's birthday, she took her mother to a very fancy buffet place. And she gave 70 dinners to people who are unknown as inspiration by Nipun. So we're really, really honored to have such a wonderful, worldwide, well-known personality to be our speaker tonight. I'd like also to introduce our wonderful translator, Dr. Carol Xu. And Dr. Carol Xu has a great passion for rethinking traditional systems, including experimental with the alternative services encouraging our collective reimagination of livelihood models rather than the business model that are aligned with our values and deepening the meditation practice and nurturing compassionate leaders and so forth. So with that, I like to give the host spot to Nipun, whose title this evening is Uncertainty as a Bridge to Compassion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ray. First of all, I very much remember that day in Taipei, that evening, and it was amazing to see how we just paid forward for people behind us and the kind of joy that it erupted in that place. Even the cashiers behind the counter who didn't even receive one of those gifts were just so excited, and I think it just goes to show you the power of love. So thank you for having me here. They say you can't cultivate without having blessings, and so I am. I always feel like it's a blessing whenever I connect with CTTV. And interestingly, I was just walking to this spot here where I get Wi-Fi, and I noticed that it was close to the full moon. And I don't know how this. I have this very odd but repeated pattern with CTTV, that I'm either it's on full moon or it's like the day before full moon, the night before. I have this, somehow full moon and CTTV always seem to connect in my life. I don't know why or how, but I'm grateful. Thank you. Back in March, I was actually in right as the pandemic hit, like in early March. I was in a 30-day meditation retreat. And when I, I thought I was in lockdown for my own cultivation. And then little did I know that when I come out, the whole world is in a lockdown. Everyone is quarantined. And it was an interesting time. It has been an interesting time in 2020 to be alive. And particularly in March, there was so much uncertainty. But the interesting thing was that during my retreats, usually in the evenings, I would read some inspiring book, a little excerpt from an inspiring book. In that retreat, I was reading the biography of Ajahn Chah, this remarkable Thai Buddhist teacher and a meditation master, whom many feel to be an arhat. And so Ajahn Chah would have this very common refrain, which was just so right for March for me, and for me to come out into the world post that retreat. And that common refrain from Ajahn Chah was, "It's all uncertain." Everything. No matter what question you asked him, ultimately he would bring it back and say, "Oh, it's uncertain." Somebody asked him, "Are you enlightened?" And he says, "It's uncertain." And is the Buddha enlightened? It's like, it's uncertain. And we think of that as kind of, what do you mean? Like, there should be certainty, right? And it's actually, I used to be a software engineer. I guess I still am. And in the software world, we have this phrase that we use. It says, this is not a bug, it's a feature. Uncertainty isn't a bug, isn't a problem to be solved. It's actually how all of life is. It's a feature. We have to embrace it. And if we embrace it, we don't collide with nature and we don't suffer as much. But if we keep longing for certainty, for surety, this kind of solidity in a fluid world, we are bound to face all kinds of problems. And so here I was in the, reading about everything is uncertain, uncertain, uncertain. And that's true in our inner worlds. Certainly everyone knows that, you can't be in the same mood, predictable mood 24 hours of the day. It's uncertain. Who knows what happens? Mind states come and go. And so you don't know. And we're all in touch with that. But we try to shirk away from that and find solidity outside. And what the pandemic did is it turned the outside world into uncertain as well. So now the inside was always uncertain and the outside is also uncertain. What are we going to do? Right? How are we going to respond? Are we going to contract in fear or will we expand in love? And this was a very real thing, I think, probably once in a generation kind of moment for us to collectively, deliberately look at this question that when faced with uncertainty, do we shrink for security or do we expand into our deeper interconnection? And even when we help now, and after disasters, everyone cooperates, right? They know that like after a tsunami would come, everyone would start cooperating and helping each other. We know that. But if you nuance that a little further, you can ask the question, are we cooperating to preserve the self, or are we cooperating to dissolve the self? And you can look at that even at a systems level and say, are we then using all our power, which, we certainly were doing all over the world because this was unprecedented. Are we going to consolidate all our power and return back to normal, which was this illusion of certainty? Or are we going to really seed a new kind of transformation? Are we just going to be in this emergency mode? Or are we going to respond with emergence? Right? These were the kinds of questions that started manifesting and showing up. And so I want to show you a few slides, share a few responses, and at some point, I hope we can get into a dialogue. And I'll try to speak a little slower so we have, because I know Carol is kindly translating for us. But how do we use this uncertainty that we're all faced with, internally and externally, as a bridge to cultivate compassion? This is not a bug, it is actually a feature. Uncertainty is an incredible tool. And like I said, this quote by Ajahn Chah, right? If you see certainty in that which is uncertain, you are bound to suffer. And there is just no two ways about it, right? And what exactly, and if Ajahn Chah is to be believed, and I certainly believe him, he says even his enlightenment, he says, birds gather on a tree and they say, oh, a tree is good or sweet or sour or bad. But as far as the tree is concerned, it doesn't really have any of that. So he says, you all are interested in figuring out if I'm enlightened or not enlightened. I have no interest in that. Like it's all uncertain, and he's living into that. So for us in service space, we decided, we saw this pandemic of fear along with the pandemic of coronavirus, and we said, well, this is not the only narrative. How do we highlight stories of people responding, not just sort of contracting in fear, and the headlines were always about toilet paper and how, at least in America, right, like everyone, oh my God, like we're going to run out of toilet paper, let's go, there's a run on toilet paper. And you can have those sorts of stories, but we felt that there wasn't enough of stories of people responding with compassion. So in mid-March, we actually launched this portal called Coronavirus, just like Corona, but much more contagious, right? Karuna is the Sanskrit word for compassion. So Coronavirus was a site which profiled all kinds of amazing stories. And you saw these remarkable stories of people, singing, although they were physically distant. I don't like the word social distance. They were physically distanced, but yet they were singing. They were wanting to connect because we're made of the same essence. This is a photo of these cops in Spain who were, these very eerie streets where no one was out and they were kind of patrolling, but they didn't really know what to do. They had a heart. What should they do? They decided there was this whole movement within the Spanish police of people who could play music and sing. They would literally go out on the streets and bring out their guitars, bring out their songs, and give a concert to everybody. Um, you had this remarkable 99-year-old retired army general who said, I can't do much. I can't even walk without my walker, but I want to do something. He says, I'm going to do laps in my backyard to raise money for the nurses and the healthcare workers that are working in the front lines. And he just wanted to raise £1,000 from his friends by his 100th birthday. And he figured he could do that. Little did he know, he became an incredible sensation, and 32 million pounds he raised, and he gave it all away. 99-year-old saying, I'm going to walk with my walker in my backyard in the spirit of solidarity. This is a very powerful photo from the early days where you have, this is from Israel in Jerusalem. You have two paramedics, one Muslim, one Jewish, and they just come out of helping somebody who was a patient. And, they decide to pray in their own ways right there on the streets. This is another remarkable story in America this time. This fellow from the Sikh faith in India, he said, in our faith teaches us to serve others. But one of the tenets of their faith is that they also never cut their hair. But they said, if he's a doctor, and they said, look, if you want to serve, you have to, at that time, people didn't know that, they didn't know how contagious it was and how it spreads. It wasn't just airborne. They thought maybe it could be caught through his hair. And he said, okay, what do I do? Right? My faith teaches me about service, and it teaches me about all these different protocols. What should I do? And he shaved just so he could risk his life and be in the front lines and help people in need. This is a fellow in Italy, a priest who was dying, and there was only one ventilator. And he says, you know what? Instead of me, give it to that young man. He has a full life in front of him. Prime Minister of New Zealand, who says, I'm going to take a 20% pay cut in solidarity. She was doing all kinds of amazing things as well. She said, I think the Easter Bunny back in March was considered an essential worker, and so she has been a really exemplary public figure. Miss England decided to give up her beauty pageantry work and re-enlist as a doctor because she was a doctor. Kids were doing amazing things to reach out to other people. I mean, the list just goes on. Musicians who couldn't hold concerts were saying, I'll just play in my front porch, and whoever wants to listen can listen. Here you see a bunch of cops in Texas drawing a heart shaped. I mean, when do you see that? So this was all happening everywhere, right? This is in Ireland. This is the last photo I have here, but this is in Ireland. There was a group of people that realized that, more than a century ago, when we were in trouble, there was a native tribe from America that actually sent us a small but significant donation to be in solidarity with us. Now their community is struggling. We should do something. And so this group of people, they start a GoFundMe page, and all of a sudden, a ton of Ireland just piles on, and millions of dollars are raised, and it goes to the Navajo Nation here, which actually had one of the highest pandemic rates. So you look at all of this and you say, is this a war story or is this a love story? Because there's a lot of the war kind of conquest. I'm going to go out and get it. But there's so much compassion as well, right? And when we write the history book, so how are we going to write it? But before even history, how are we experiencing it ourselves? What are we holding on to? What are we amplifying in our own selves? And how does that ripple out into all the other things we do? Right? This is, when you look at all meditators, and here we have so many incredible meditators, know that, they say there's that phrase that says there's two sides to a coin, right? And yes, that's true. Oh, sorry, I just somehow stopped sharing screen. They say there's two sides to every coin, but I think a meditator will tell you there's actually many sides, not just two sides. And when we start to engage with the world in this very limited way, when we start collapsing our minds, when we start shrinking our minds, we start to really turn this infinity of life into a very narrow this or that kind of a binary position, right? That, it's either heads or tails, it's either this or that. And that same logic that converts the infinity of life into these binary choices is the same logic that is now creating incredible polarities. It's not even like, let's dialogue about your opinion of this fact and my opinion of this fact. It's now we don't even know, we can't even agree on a fact. So it's not even binary anymore. It's like there's no dialogue between the binary. So they just feel, polarizing, separate sort of worlds. And so how do we start to turn this around, right? How do we start to take this fear narrative and this like collapsing and this contraction and this collapsing of like this in the spectrum of life into this very narrow binary choice? Pretty soon it's not even binary. How do you turn that cycle from this to something much more expansive, something much more about interconnection and much more about compassion? And I think at its core, I have this photo of just do it and just say no, right? Like, so on one side, we have just say yes, like you can do it, go out and conquer the world. And on the other side, this is the Nike slogan on one side, and this is the famous Nancy Reagan quote, right? And just say no to drugs. I mean, of course, saying yes is so incredibly meaningful. And of course, saying no and having boundaries is a very healthy thing to do in many circumstances. But if those are the only two choices, what we do is we crowd out the maybe in the middle, right? No one says, people appreciate that conviction you have. He's a real go-getter. He just says yes. And it's like, there's this, or he's so strong, you can't penetrate. Like he's just got this wall. But maybe is kind of seen as a weakness in our society. But I actually think that the pandemic is teaching us to really to ignite the power of maybe. In Buddhism, of course, there's the middle way, but so many people, the middle way is not between this right and this wrong. It's between this right and this right. Right? It's not that you need to have incredible effort and just effort alone is going to get you enlightened. And it's not that it's this incredible surrender and surrender alone is going to get you there. You need effort and you need surrender and you need to find the middle way. And like that with everything, how do we learn to start to find the middle way? And in this culture, we've sort of lost track of that middle. And when you do that, it's not just that it creates polarities in, say, the political world or inequality in the economic world. or disconnection in the younger generation, even our basic virtues start to get hijacked, right? So you can start to look at, say, generosity, and people will say, oh, generosity is just for the privileged. You can start to look at kindness, and people will say kindness is a pacifier for the status quo, right? It's a way to keep kids quiet so they don't raise trouble about it. So now kindness is framed as, if you're a CEO of a company and you say, please be kind, people will say, oh, you just don't want me to oppose you. That's why you just want me to shut up and be a slave. And so kindness is seen in that way. Service is framed as a denial of self-care, right? You can go, and meditation, right? It's always just an escape from suffering. And so you start to really have this intellectual stalemate in a world that crowds out the middle. So we cannot afford to lose the middle. We cannot afford to lose the power of maybe. Maybe is what allows us to hold both sides and actually nurture them into not just two sides, but an incredible spectrum, a healthy, alive, vibrant spectrum on both sides. So some of you might have heard this story. I think it's an ancient Chinese parable of a farmer who one fine day his horse runs away, and all the neighbors come to him and say, sorry, farmer, you really is my condolences. And the farmer says, maybe. And the next day, the horse that had run away comes back with 3 other wild horses. And all the neighbors like, farmer, man, you're a lucky guy. Congratulations. Wow, amazing, good karma. And farmer says, maybe. Then the next day, his son goes out and takes the horse out for a ride, but he falls down, he gets hurt. And again, everybody's like, oh man, I'm so sorry to hear that. And the farmer says, maybe. And then he goes the next day, the army, it turns out, a story is a story, right? And the army, the army comes in for a draft, but because the son is injured, they don't draft him. And everyone comes together again and says to the old farmer, wow, you're a lucky guy, man. That is so amazing. Remark, congratulations. I'm so happy for you. And the farmer just says, maybe. Maybe, said the farmer. Now for the ego craves certainty. It wants the yes or no. It wants the solidity. So the ego is not really happy with this maybe. But if you listen to the teachings of the Buddha, right? The Buddha very clearly said that no one, no arhat even, can know the laws of cause and effect in its entirety. Sure, we can know some causes to some effects, but we're not going to know everything. I mean, and if you don't know everything, it was never in your control anyways. So why are we trying to press this issue of certainty? Why are we going after certainty instead of just holding maybe? And this becomes a very interesting question. Now, it's hard for the ego because the ego wants solidity. It doesn't want ambiguity. It doesn't want fluidity. So it's hard, but it's also hard because maybe is a tough pill to swallow. How do you look at the world and say maybe, right? This is like 2 p.m. On a couple months ago, maybe less than 2 months ago, there were so many fires. The sky is no longer blue. How do you say maybe to that? Right? We're heating things up by our practices, by our greed, by our consumptive nature that we cannot stop. This is 130 degrees Fahrenheit, 59 degrees centigrade in Death Valley in America. We're heating up the planet and we're destroying ourselves in the process. And how do we hold that with maybe? It's hard. This is a woman wearing a I can't breathe face mask, and she's waiting in line to actually vote. Um, but such a powerful image, right? How do you look at all the injustices and say, maybe? This is in the early on in the pandemic times. You had all these potatoes that people were throwing away. And then you had unprecedented number of millions of people who were, for the first time, waiting in line for food handouts at the food pantries because they didn't have any income and they couldn't afford it. And so how is it that you have such a colossal breakdown in, this is one of the most famous chefs in the world, saying, how is it possible that these two photos exist at the same time in the most prosperous and technologically advanced moment? And 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 here's something else about technology. This is a game called Fortnite. Now, Fortnite has more active members than the entire population of America. In the month of um, April alone, just in 1 month, 30 days, 3.3 billion hours were spent playing this video game. And so you look at that and you say, is that good? Is that bad? How do you say maybe to that? Right? Billionaires saw their net worth increase by $500 billion during the pandemic. This is just a recent headline from a couple weeks ago. Right? How do you say maybe to that? This I saw actually today, although it was a couple months ago, but top scientists are saying collapse of civilization is now the most likely outcome. How do you say maybe to that? Right? And I think what I want to say is this is a time when faced with all of this, so maybe is not easy. So you can see why it's not just for the ego that you want a yes or no, but you want to kind of feel like you have the answers, that you're in the driver's seat, that you're going to create the kind of effect that the world needs. But maybe that's putting too much emphasis on our ego. Maybe our ego is not the right place to be finding that solution. And so there's this very beautiful quote. I think times like these invite us to deepen our faith. And there's this very beautiful quote by Adyashanti, who's a Zen teacher, and he says, faith is a withholding of conclusion, so we allow what is to arise. Right? It's not in some gloomy pie in the sky kind of thing. It's a withholding of conclusion, saying, I don't know. Is this good? Is this bad? Maybe, said the farmer. But that maybe allows you to zoom out, and that zooming out gives a chance for what is to arise. And that what is remarkable because it is codependent, co-arising, and it is deeply, deeply interconnected. And the arc of that interconnection necessarily bends towards great compassion. So this maybe actually gets us to see things in a different way, which then allows us to tap into a deep interconnection and arrive at compassion, which is a very profound sort of a thing. Right? And I love this graphic and the infinity sign of it, that when we see a lot of suffering, that with that suffering is necessarily an ignition of compassion for those who have those vows and those tendencies. They will have it in even greater degree. But even if you don't have the bodhisattva vows, even then you will still respond to suffering with compassion, because compassion is precisely, the Buddha said, there is suffering. That's the first noble truth. That's like right off the starting gate, right? I'm not even Buddhist, and I still know that this is what the Buddha said, right? Like it's just a very basic thing about the Buddha. So there is suffering. There always has been suffering. But with suffering is a wish to come out of that suffering, and the wish to help others come out of that suffering, and that is compassion. And so these are going to be always interlocked in this infinity, and maybe allows us to tap into that. Now, in service space, we've been doing a whole bunch of things, but the way we have been asking this question is we started this, we just had thousands, tens of thousands of people joining our dialogues and saying, yeah, this fear narrative is collapsing and the traditional institutions are too rigid to actually create any change. You guys are all volunteers. What can we do? Let's roll up our sleeves and innovate. Let's transform new patterns for society. And so we started doing a whole bunch of things. One of the things that came up was this idea of a pod, which is a hands, head, heart sort of a learning platform, a peer-to-peer learning platform. And it's had, I won't tell you too much about it, but it's been a remarkable sort of emergence. But at its core, what it's trying to do is bridge the content with the context, right? That's where, so it's not just a spiritual thing to embrace the power of maybe. Of course, it's a very profound spiritual truth that everything is changing, that everything is uncertain, as Ajahn Chah said. But it's not just that. It's that it also has design implications. And how do we learn to design for that flow? How do we learn to shift to not just take the content by itself, but to actually animate it with a context? And the easiest way to understand that is to say, if you just go for the fruits without paying attention to the tree or to how much water you give it, to how much sun it gets, to the health of the soil, to the atmosphere, if you forget about all of those things, if you're just going for the fruit, that's the content, but the context is everything else. And in our culture today, because of our incessant greed in so many ways, we've just been plucking after the fruits. And so how do we connect the fruits to the roots? And that's been the question around these pods, right? How do we connect the fruits to its roots? And we used to be able to do this, right? These are circles. We would have so many, thousands of them all over the world. In all kinds of different formations. This feels like a world ago, but now we're doing this. So how do we turn these squares, these Zoom squares, and what is the creative? It's an invitation to get creative. And how do we start to get creative with these Zoom squares and turn them into a circle of deep ties, circle of noble friendship, at least a possibility of noble friendship? What is that arc? And that's something we've been thinking about, right? So if you take this input and apply this pod platform process, our hope is that you get a community of deep ties, circles of deep ties, not just one community, many, many communities. And I think at its core, it tries to bring together silicon intelligence, which is computing possibilities, with our carbon, which is our own physical matter, right? The carbon intuition, which has its own intelligence, and combine it with this eternal flow of compassion. So if you can use those in the right balance, usually the problem is the technology guys only know one part of it. The mystics only know the second part of it. The bodhisattvas only know the third part of it. So how do you combine all of them? And in service space, we've been experimenting with that, but we need many more of these kinds of experiments, right? I want to end with this beautiful photo, which has just really moved me ever since I first saw it. There was a, I believe, a German photographer in Spain. He was just taking photos, and he's just clicking, and he didn't even realize that he took this photo. It so happened that there were these birds, these thousands and thousands of these starlings that were just floating around, and they're going about their business in small formations. All of a sudden, they see this incredible potential for suffering, this giant parasite that's coming to get them. And so they decided to get together on a 10-second notice into this formation of a giant bird. So this looks like a bird, but it's actually, and it is, but it's actually a collection of all these starlings coming together very, very spontaneously, collectively into this formation So this parasite then says, oh, that's too big a bird. I'm not going to mess with that. It goes away, and these guys dissolve. It happened so quickly that the photographer didn't even realize he took this photo. It was National Geographic runner-up for Photo of the Year last year. And so I think what this invites us to think about is that who do we have to be that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? I think the power of maybe invites us to withhold conclusion, so we allow this what is, which is this incredible potential. Look at these birds. They are not saying, I want to be at the beak and I want to be here, and no, rearrange. Okay, let's have a 5-hour Zoom call to figure out what are the form. No, they're doing this spontaneously because they are tapped into something much deeper. And so how do we learn to start? How do we tune in to that? Just a second here. I'm hearing someone else. So I would just conclude with this idea that I think maybe allows us to see that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And as we see that, it invites us to become instruments for that kind of a whole. And in doing so, we ignite great compassion. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, Ray, you are muted. I think you have to unmute yourself, Ray. I can't hear you. There it is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nipun.
Yeah.
As always, it's such a great motivational speech and coming from your heart. And the lessons of your last picture is phenomenal.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 10-second instantaneous formation, just and I remember seeing your picture. I remember, the Canadian geese always fly in certain formations.
Yes.
They take turns because the head goose, always have the heaviest resistance.
Yeah.
Then it rotates, all right? Then, for example, if one of them got hurt because somebody shot them or whatever, when they fell down, there's one or two geese following it until that goose, recovers.
Yeah. And I think it takes a lot of humility of the spirit to kind of to engage with others in that way, and not from a place of right or wrong, but from that middle path of maybe,
Yeah. Well, I also thought about your sort of middle way, the maybe, uncertainty. Well, there's a precise formulation of that, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle.
Yeah, that's right.
You can't measure something in the right location at the same time, It's maybe, right?
That's right. Indeed.
And so in a way, from your talk, perhaps, looking into the future, what you have been doing in service space is building a foundation leading to the future of maybe. And by merging the content and context together.
Yeah.
And that's phenomenal. So in a sense, when many people complain about coronavirus, and which actually is teaching us a big lesson of humanity and respect.
Yeah.
So we actually should be thankful, because otherwise we are continuing going on this, yes and no binary logic. We're going to be doomed.
Yeah. I think we drown in certainty. I think it's this idea of impermanence is, it sounds like a scary thing, right? Like we we identify ourselves as the wave and not as the ocean. And when because of that fundamental ignorance, that we're so preoccupied and we're clinging to this wave, and then when the wave comes up we get happy, and then when the wave dies we're like, but the whole thing is it's ephemeral, and so you were actually never the wave to begin with, you were actually the ocean in which the waves arise and pass. And so this kind of a pandemic allows us a chance, for those who want to take that chance, to look deeply at the suffering and say, oh, how, what is this teaching me? And it's not to escape and say, I don't care about the suffering. It's actually to use it as an opportunity to awaken great compassion. Um, and because that's absolutely a very legitimate response to it. So you can not only transform your relationship to suffering, but you can also awaken great compassion, and that has design implications. So, yeah, yeah. I think,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, I think it was a great opportunity.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take much my time in participating, but anybody who have a question would like to ask in the phone, please use the chat room. Oh, there are two already, right? Let me look at it. Oh, okay. There's no question yet. Somebody
Okay.
just mentioned that the Chinese translation is wonderful. Thank you very much, Carol. It's tough to do a simultaneous translation.
Yeah, very hard. And and I think Carol also lives into these values, which is probably
That's
why
right. That's right.
it's a little easier. So very grateful.
So how do you, well, despite the fact that, on one hand, we are thankful to uh, to the virus of teaching us a lesson. On the other hand, you look into the United States, the death row is passing 250,000,
Yeah.
and every day so many more thousands infection, come to surface. But we're pretty stubborn, this is
Yeah.
a 0-1 society. We're going ahead for the party, going flying.
Yeah.
So where do you see the future that's coming, maybe out of your effort?
Well, I mean, I think it's a, we've had a lot of dialogues with many people, many traditional leaders, and say, like the founder of edX, for example, which is an online learning platform, and he's saying, hey, everyone is coming online, but is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And maybe right now we don't have a choice, um, but pretty soon we're going to be so acclimated to this new way of being that it's like, I mean, I think of it as like, we used to call people on, when it was like my friend's birthday growing up, right? You call, and as you call, his mom or dad picks up, and you're like, and you kind of have this relationship. And you're like, oh, can I talk to Dewey? And my friend Dewey will like, or she'll say, okay, he's not here. Can you call back? Or I'm doing this or something. And then I would end up meeting her at graduation or somewhere in between, and we would have this, and that's all part of the context. And now it's like really point to point just on Facebook, and it's just so convenient to just say happy birthday. And then pretty soon it just, people even automate that. And there are tools that let you just say, hey, happy birthday, Ray. And then Ray on the receiving end says, oh, that's kind of cheap anyways, right? Um, and so that becomes a new norm. We normalize a lot of this kind of a cheaper engagement with life. And that, I think, is the risk, right? So that's where people, like in the education sector, where I was saying was that maybe right now everyone is online and you're asking some of these questions, and maybe we're even innovating, but if convenience if short-term convenience is our organizing principle, then we will accelerate this technological change. We have already accelerated it by 10 years. But in what direction, right? Is it just in the direction of short-term convenience? If so, what are we compromising? What are we giving up? And all too often, we are giving up deep connections. And if we give up deep connections, where does that take us? That takes us to an extreme disconnection with even the world outside. So we're just spending 3.3 billion hours, in one video game. I mean, and there's thousands and thousands of these video games, right? And if that's the world where we give up on this carbon, experience and say, look, people are so, confused and they're so opinionated. I can't even agree what is a fact with them. So let's just forget about that and let's just create a new avatar, right? Now I am this personality online, and then you live off of that and you get the serotonin and the dopamine and the oxytocin. The reason why the wise people would say that's a mistake is because this is fundamentally what we are doing with our own carbon apparatus. This is already a made up, fabricated idea of self. And on top of that, now we're going to compound other layers. That just means you get deeper and deeper into delusion and farther away from awakening. So is it wise to add a different layer? And the whole apparatus right now is heading in that direction, saying climate change, we've already destroyed. We already destroyed the planet, and we don't see a way out of it. We don't see a way to U-turn. So what should we do? Colonize Mars. Like, that's the idea. That's like the direction. Oh, we've already destroyed our social relationships. So what should we do? Create avatars and create virtual realities. So how do we reignite this faith in humanity, right? In us, in compassion, in awakening? That this is actually, it's like this itself, this idea of self itself is a problem. Let's deconstruct that instead of trying to, run away from it and compound our misery.
Well, one of the lessons we learned is that I saw a comment from somebody in Beijing. Well, the whole city is quieter. I don't hear much noises anymore. Wow, by the way, the sky is blue.
Yeah.
All right. So those are the sort of lessons we're learning, and in terms of moving into the future, in addition to the technological advances. But where is the humanity in this advance that can go along with it?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of lesson. Carol, you have any comment?
Oh, we won't be able to hear her in the English channel.
Oh,
unfortunately.
Mr. Relio, can you help?
Yes. So what do you need? You want to ask her whether she has any comments?
Right.
But Ray, we also have 4 questions if we want to go to those.
Right. I forgot it.
I see a couple of hands up, maybe.
One question is that
会往在不确定的时代里大发展。
I think.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello, Faye.
Hello, Nipun. Hello, teacher.
Wow.
My question is, because of this virus, so it gives us a special time and space to be together, to stay indoor. So in my opinion, it also gives us enough time to think about ourselves, and the
Yeah.
relationship with ourselves and others.
Yeah.
Are there any chance that we can rethink of the feminism, the influence or the potential development of the feminism could have some new development or new uncertainty or something for their future jobs or being a creators or
Yeah.
their how to say, the new possibilities
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
women, for females.
Oh,
Sorry,
that's a great question. Where are you calling from, Faye?
I'm
In
from
Beijing.
Beijing.
Beijing. Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the big things that we need right now is a resurgence of the divine feminine. A divine feminine is very different from, say, a divine masculine. And you need both of those in balance. But right now, the world is so driven by the divine masculine energy that it's completely out of whack. We have forgotten how to care. We've forgotten how to nurture. We've forgotten about intrinsic motivations. And so I think the way things are going and the resources that we have and the kind of leadership that we have, that we see all around the world, is not a leadership, it's a power over leadership instead of a power with. And what divine feminine teaches us is power with kind of leadership, right? When my mom, the way my mom leads me in as I'm growing up is a power with relationship. It's not like, oh, you're now going to do everything that I tell you to do. And that kind of a energy is exactly what we need right now. Like in America, you know, the kind of president that we just had was a very much power over relationship, right? That was the transactional mindset, and that is, you know, that is completely. We are very skewed in that direction. So I think this, if we are going to find any solution that works, it will come from the divine feminine. So I think it's an incredible opportunity, and I think young women like you should rise up and not try to be like the traditional leaders. Be a leader that you are called to be, because your heart knows something that the world needs right now. And that is, I think, very critical if we are going to survive.
Are there some suggestions for our young female leaders? You know, maybe some tips or some recommendation. Sorry.
Sure.
Some
we
recommendation
actually,
or some area.
what I would say is we have a whole portal. I would say go to this portal called Laddership. So leadership is a very command and control army style of leadership. And then we try to soften it up and we say, let's have let's have servant leadership. But what we're talking about is a very different kind of leadership, and there was no word for it. So we created a word called laddership. So instead of like what business schools will teach you about planning and executing, right? You have a 5-year plan and you execute and you make it happen. What laddership does is it tells you something very different. It's a very different way to lead. It, instead of planning and executing, it's searching and amplifying. Instead of power at the center, it's power at the edges, right? All these sorts of things. If you look at it from a divine feminine lens, it offers you a very interesting way to explore. So we don't have time to get into it, but I would highly recommend that you go to laddership.org, and we have all kinds of people. Thousands of people have taken these laddership circles and pods, and I think it's just a great way to bring this into circulation. What does it look like to lead from your heart and not just from your head? What does it look like to lead not just for efficiency, but for resiliency? What does it look like where you as a leader don't have to be in the center, where you can actually be like a bodhisattva in the back? So what does all that look like? So I think we need to innovate there, but there's a lot of resources if you go to laddership.org that can point you in that direction.
Thank you very much. And Nipun, there's a few questions here.
Yeah.
So let me switch. Yeah. This question is, would you please share your thoughts on what can be done to bring a sharply divided country together using compassion, or maybe?
How do we build bridges instead of barriers, right? And I think this is absolutely the question of the hour. Certainly in America, but I think all over the world, especially as we have like a lot of forces in play have used the fear narrative to collapse, to contract even more, right? Which creates even more polarities. How do you create bridges? There are so many responses to that. I think there's an internal response, there's an interpersonal response, and then there's a systemic response. But I would say one very specific thing that I think we need to learn, and this is actually an article that I read in one of the pods. I see that Sheila was talking about the Brahmavihara's pod. In that Brahmavihara pod that we just completed, there was a reading by Ajahn Sumedho. And Ajahn Sumedho, incidentally, I didn't have this planned, but I guess Ajahn Chah is coming up. Ajahn Sumedho had this beautiful article, and he says, you don't have to like everybody to love them. You don't have to like somebody to love them, right? That there is a difference between like and love. So a liking is, oh my God, Ray, I love your worldview. I love how you think. I love the ideas that you put forth. And wow, you're just a replica of what's going on in my mind. I really like you. Mind to mind connecting is not going to get you to a field of love. Love is what your heart does. So the mind has its place. We have to operate in the realm of thought in the field of matter and mind. But the heart, right? I've been reading the biography of Ajahn Chah's teacher, Ajahn Mun, and he says the most critical thing is the heart. And the heart only knows love. Either it's blocked, like you have all these thick clouds over it, but once you unblock all those clouds, all it can do is just love. So I think as a core competency, we need to know how to love even if we don't like some belief, some worldview, some interpretation, or anything about somebody. How do you still love despite not seeing face to face? I think if we ignite that, which means to learn to lead from the heart, not just from the mind, I think that will be a great start to building bridges. And of course, there's so many systemic. I mean, I could give you a whole 1 hour on the ways in which we can personally, interpersonally, and systemically do that. But I think at its core, it's about shifting from the head to the heart and learning how to hold both of those in integrity. And we are way too much in our heads, which means we're way too driven by our thoughts. And over-identification with thoughts is naturally going to create these divides. So to me, that's the spiritual response that I have.
Thank you. Here's another one. How do we practice in the midst of uncertainty while trying to stay grounded and centered?
Yeah, it is helpful to have a sense of solidity. And I love stories, and stories is a great example of something that gives you a sense of false solidity. We all love stories, I've heard so many stories from Reverend Heng Sure about, I've read so many stories of Master Hua. I love stories of people and biographies of spiritual masters. But a story ultimately is just going to be a perception. And that perception, though, is going to give you a sense of false solidity. It doesn't mean you should discard all of the false solidity. Sometimes false solidity can be very, very helpful. If we're going through a really tough time in life, false solidity can provide you a temporary way station. If you think about our bodies is a kind of false solidity. So you can't just intellectually bypass this and say, oh, well, I read in this book that it's all impermanent anyway, so forget about it. It doesn't work. You do have to feed the body every day, right? So you have to take care of your apparatus. You have to take care of, and you have to use these, these prescriptions of solidity to help us ground, and at the same time, not become attached. And so even the answer here is a maybe, right? Do you use solidity or do you embrace fluidity? The middle path is the maybe, that yes, there are going to be times that you have to embrace solidity, solidity of stories, solidity of your body, solidity of ideas, solidity of aspirations. These are all perceptions. So we have to use them, and they are helpful, because otherwise the Buddha wouldn't have shared anything, right? So he shared, even though it's imperfect, because anything that is spoken is not the eternal Tao. But he shared because that is useful. At the same time, we also want to be anchored in fluidity. And so with everything, I would say the practice, at least that I embrace, is don't look and say, oh, this is a virtue. Oh, this is a fantastic thing, right? Like, and this is it. I found the answer. Anything, any virtue, right? Even like I said earlier, effort and surrender. You need grit. Grit is an incredible thing. When the Buddha sits down, like he had, and his last final sit, he said, no matter what happens, even if all my legs go away, wither away, I'm not moving. Right? That is incredible grit. And yet, this deep, deep surrender to what is. Who knows when awakening is going to happen? Maybe it happens 30 lifetimes later. He doesn't know. And you're holding both of these. So any virtue that we see that we want to cultivate, if we go too much in one direction or the other, then we're not going to be grounded. But if we can find the maybe in the middle and say, okay, and that's hard, because now you have to kind of live into, you have to figure out, okay, I can't read in a book whether I should have fluidity or solidity right now. Right? I have to live into it. Should I relax and go into my metacognition, or should I focus and go into a deeper samadhi? These are questions every moment we have to ask these questions. Every day, even on the cultivation path, we have to constantly be holding these questions. And others may be able to guide us if we're fortunate, but ultimately we have to be able to learn to find that balance. And so I think that's, to me, is the key, is to say anything that we aspire for, to find the two rights, and then to negotiate a middle path that is dynamic. That is not a recipe that you downloaded from the internet and that you cut and paste, that you're living into. And your capacity to do that, continually straddle the middle. The middle is not a piece of cake. It's like walking on a razor's edge, right? It is very, very hard, right? But your capacity to stay on point will be directly proportional. And this is something Master Hua taught, and that the Buddha said very clearly, will be directly proportional to the amount of noble friends, not the amount, to the web of noble friends, to the affinities that you have created. Because this is not an ego thing. It's like, I would love to stay in the middle always perfectly, and I just want to build a bigger ego so I can do all this, but you're not going to be able to do it because your ego is not sufficiently qualified to straddle that line. And so you will fall and you will get hurt, but when you fall, if you fall on a concrete floor, it's going to hurt a lot. but if you fall on a trampoline, you will be able to bounce back even higher and keep continuing to find the middle. And what is that trampoline? Community of noble friends. So that's a long response to your question, but I think in summary, it's fine. Don't go for the, this is right and this is wrong. Find the two rights and find the middle, and surround yourself by noble friends.
Well, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions. So let me ask you a question. You know that
right, there's just one comment. Do you want to read that out from Van? Or maybe Van can speak up, or if you raise your hand, Van.
Oh, let's see.
Maybe scares the baby Buddha out of me. Go ahead, Ray. I don't. It was just a comment, so you can go ahead.
Yeah. Well, one new message. Wow. Okay. Here's the new message. None of these ideas will be of any use unless we educate our youth. Education cannot be initially in Buddha's ethics, but just in reality perception, logic, math, and how to seek out scientific truth. Our problem now in America is that there is a very substantial minority, almost 51% enough, to elect Donald Trump, who deeply believe what Trump has been putting out for the past 4 years and before. Trump did not create the radical NRA activity. They found him. That's a long question.
and Ray, I was looking at another one which was actually a private comment. But
I see. Okay.
I can read that out as well. But yeah, it says maybe scares the baby Buddha out of me. But I'll focus on this one first. Yeah, I mean, it's, we certainly have to educate, but I wouldn't say any of these ideas are not going to be of any use. I would say that we don't know the cause and effect. So if we plant a seed, this Japanese farmer, he says he wrote a book called One Straw Revolution, and he says one straw can create a revolution. But we just don't know the ripple effect of it. So I don't tend to think that, these ideas of compassion are ill-placed. I think they're eternal, and I think they're very squarely faced. But I think the intention of the question is we do have short-term emergencies, right? And how do we respond to those emergencies while holding the long-term emergence in balance, right? So if your house is burning down, you can't be talking about it. But at the same time, what Gandhi would teach us is that even if your house is burning down, if you use violent methods for short-term gain, that's actually not good mathematics. So we need to think about where we actually land on this spectrum. One of our very core volunteers was Obama's general counsel. And she drafted the Iraqi constitution. She drafted the Afghani constitution. She was, she's one of these people who's created remarkable systemic change. I mean, a constitution of a country is the ultimate system that you craft. And after all of that, right, she keeps climbing up and up and up and up the ladder. And then she comes to service base and she says, look, I think I was climbing up the ladder for more and more power, but I realized that maybe my ladder was up against the wrong wall. That we are climbing. So, what is it that is actually going to transform? And one of the very insightful things she shared was that she says, we have governance that aims to curtail vice. So our whole governance is about curtailing vice and not about amplifying virtue. And as a result, it can really cascade in a downward spiral. And so how are we going to balance? Of course, we have to, we have to contain the vice, right? But how do we then also, what are the architectures for amplifying virtue? And those are two very different architectures. Like you need the military to control vice. You cannot have the military to say, now I'm going to go out and create compassion. You can put all the scientists together, and they are working on this, by the way, call this thing called a compassion pill. But you're not going to have a compassion pill. Yeah, because they're saying, oh, what makes you more generous? Well, if you have more oxytocin in your body and you release serotonin, you have a little bit of a dopamine kick. All of that leads to more generous behavior. And so they've tried all these things, and they're working on this. And I think that's completely misguided, because it's using the architecture that we use for controlling vice to amplify virtue, and that's not really going to work. So I think it requires a deeper inquiry. I think, like the inquiry we had folks from MIT. We've been in conversation with Chancellor UC Berkeley, and everyone's asking the question of education, but the architectures they have are basically factory farming architectures. And so they're like, yeah, I get this. I know values can't be taught, they have to be caught. And we haven't really invested in that ambiance of catching these values. So what can you do? Maybe certainly you can do something, and you should do something. But how do you, these are tough questions, right? If you're sitting in the chancellor at UC Berkeley and you say, look, I want to educate a whole new population, every chancellor will agree, and I've spoken to many of them, right? But the infrastructure they have is driven by extrinsic motivations, is driven by short-termism, and so they can do many things well, but they can't do all things. And one of the things that we can see that they can't do is teach us values, put us on this arc of emergence that bends towards great compassion. And so these are the challenges. And this is why, to Faye's question from Beijing, I think it's going to be the divine feminine leadership that will illuminate a new way. I don't know what that new way is. I keep doing my little bits. Maybe they're useless, I don't know, or maybe it creates a ripple effect. But I think if all of us keep trying, if all of us keep planting these seeds, maybe like each bird in that giant configuration that we saw, no one knows it's this giant bird, but they're doing their small bit. And collectively, it's adding up to that. And so I don't think you and I and like all the smartest people that we know need to come together and come craft like this thing that's going to, maybe we should try. I've been in plenty of these panels and where we do think about it, we do explore at the more worldly level. But I think my deepest wisdom tells me that I just have to keep planting seeds. And I just have to keep trusting that, yes, the first noble truth, there is suffering, but yes, with that suffering is also the awakening of this wish to come out of suffering, which is great compassion. And that, I think, is what drives me. And I think we have to apply that to technology design. We have to apply that to education design. We have to apply that to social design. Look at what social media is doing to us. We have to apply that to political design, where, we just had an election, but when 70 million people are voting for Trump, like, okay, is that a win for Biden, or what is it, And so how do we start to really apply some of these principles in our own small ways or big ways in the trenches? And I think that becomes that's a much harder question than to just say, hey, what's the smoking gun? I don't think there's a smoking gun. What's the smoking gun for climate change? This is such a sad thing, right? It breaks your heart. And yet, then what are we going to do? Are we just going to be hopeless? Or are we just going to say, look, I will still do my little bit? So I land on that side of, these are hard questions. I agree. I don't know if there's a smoking gun. As somebody who's steeped into systemic, interpersonal, and personal transformation, I personally am not capable enough, maybe, to see like the complete smoking gun, and yet I have this incredible faith, and I have this trust in the overarching arc of humanity. And so maybe I'll end with this, Ray, because I know we're going way over time here, but I'll end with a Ajahn Chah story. And you know, since we're talking about education, you would hope that we all get educated with teachers like Master Hua and Ajahn Chah, right? And they teach in such beautiful ways. And this was such a simple story, but it touched me so deeply. Because I think at a time like this, with so many challenges, so many compounding catastrophes, where even the top scientists are saying collapse of civilization, even in times like that, or especially in times like that, we need to awaken gifts that we didn't know we had. We need to, you know, there's many seeds when there's a fire. There's many seeds that sprout only under the extreme duress of that fire, of the heat from that fire. And so here we are in this heat. How do we get out of the way? How do we get out of the binary? How do we get out of our over-identification with our thoughts and our ideas, withhold conclusion, and allow something to arise that we could not have imagined? Right? What is that? How do you even hold that? And I think, what is my job? Like, this is the question I ask myself. If I want to allow that to happen, if I want this formation to happen, what is my job, my small everyday person job? And this is the story from Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah said, he says, what is grace? Somebody asked him. He says, grace is or maybe somebody didn't use the word grace, but they essentially were asking him that. And he had this beautiful example, such a simple example, but it's like stuck with me. And he says, it's like holding out your hand under a mango tree. And if it's time, if it's for you to receive that and do something with it, the mango will fall in your hand. And if it doesn't, it's not for you to touch it. That is a profound spiritual advice that you can get in a lot of trouble by doing something that's not yours to do, or by ignoring the mango that falls in your palm. And most of us, what we do is we start moving our hands and we start saying, oh, you know, oh, mango's going to fall here. Mango's going to fall here. I want the mango, right? Or we start climbing up the tree, right? And we start taking, you know, saying, I want the mango sooner. Or we start like genetically modifying the tree and we say, I'm going to have an abundance of mangoes, right? We start shaking the tree. We do all these schemes, what Master Hua would call climbing on conditions. And we have to stop climbing on conditions, and we have to trust nature, even if it's short-term suffering, or even if it is a solution that is large scale that we are in. How do we learn to just hold our hand and trust that what falls and be responsible? So first we have to wait for it to fall, and then to be responsible with what is ours to do. And that sounds like an easy thing, that, hey, this is given to me, I'm going to do it. But it's much more nuanced than that. Right? And I think if we learn to do that, if we practice, I think we can get to that point where we embrace all this with new eyes and a new heart, like Master Hua's teacher. I mean, my God, like he wouldn't he was starving and he was dying, walking in like the cold weather, you know, and he still like, he just kind of trusted this deep grace. He says, even if I have to die, it's okay, you know. And then someone comes and ends up in his life. Like it's so how, you know, and does that make a difference? At that time, you could have said, whatever, it's an old man, like he lives and dies, like what difference does it make, you know? But it ended up creating this remarkable ripple effect that no one could foresee. And so maybe we can all be a small part of that. Maybe we can all be that Sujata that gives the milk pudding to the Buddha. At that time, she just thinks he's a starving monk, you know? I mean, and here it is. And so I would encourage all of us to play our small bit and trust in grace, have faith, and to do that and withhold conclusion and embrace the maybe. I think that might be the only thing we have left at our disposal at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Nipun, for the wonderful talk, and that inspired a lot of people, including myself, as always. And I would like to take this opportunity also to announce that next week we have Professor Brown from Berkeley, and I don't know what she's going to talk about, but she wrote a beautiful book called The Buddha's Economics, which is fittingly continuing what Nipun is talking about. Then the week following, we have Professor Jiang Wu, who is going to talk about the future of education. Again, the topic that was mentioned, but we haven't go into the deep discussion this evening due to the time constraint. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Carol Su, who was doing the translation in the Chinese room. Again, this is what we have. I think we probably need to end this evening but if anybody who is interested to communicate with Mr. Nipun, you can forward me, or I can forward the question, or you can forward your question directly to him. So with that, I want to take a deep bow to Dhamma Master Jing Yong, who started this lecture series, and then I think now we can dedicate the merit to Buddha. So maybe we can all.
So to save time, let's chant this in Chinese. It's getting very late. 愿以此功德，庄严佛净土，上报四重恩，下济三途苦。若有见闻者，悉发菩提心，尽此一报身，同生极乐国。In respect to the Venerable Master, Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.